opportunity to speak with you. I have a lot of information that hopefully I can share with you all today. I've been teaching wilderness skills and self-reliance for about 15 years. I run the Earth Native Wilderness School. We're a self-reliance and outdoor education school based in Bastrop, Texas, so just a little bit north of you all. And we teach courses to adults and kids, mostly on outdoor education. But over the years, I've also been asked to teach urban survival skills. And while my focus is mostly wilderness skills, there's a lot that really translates into urban skills. And I have done a lot of urban courses over the years as well. I will say that there's a lot of information and we have a fairly short amount of time. So I'm really trying to distill down and give you guys kind of the most, I don't know, the most pertinent information. And I'll try to answer your questions as best as I can as we go through the presentation. So I prepared a presentation for everyone and I'll take you through it, and hopefully that'll give you a really good overview, and then we'll take questions as they come. If you ask a question about something that I'm going to get to in the future, I'll just let you know, and then hopefully we'll have some opportunities for questions at the end. If you want hands-on training in wilderness skills, we do offer courses, and I'd love to see you at one of our classes at some point in the future. Great, so with that, let me share my screen and we'll get to the class. All right. Here we go. All right, so urban survival and disaster preparedness. I'm not a doomsday person. I don't really, I don't teach wilderness skills for the purposes of the end of the world. That's just not where I come from. I love the outdoors. I love spending time in the outdoors, and I also have a deep interest in being able to take care of myself and my family, and that's really how I approach wilderness skills. And I also approach outdoor skills from a place of fun and life enhancement, and not from a place of fear. That being said, I do believe that there are a lot of things that we should be prepared for in life, and it is really not a matter of if critical scenarios will happen to us, but when. And when we're caught off guard by things that are very predictable, it's really our own fault. We really should be prepared for those scenarios. So you guys being in this class is really a good first step. And then from here, you'll just need to kind of continue to take steps to continue to evolve your plan and continuously update your preparedness based on what's going on in the world. All right, why is this not working? Okay, here we go. So how do I define survival? To me, survival situation is not something that just happens in the woods. Really, a survival situation is any situation that we find ourselves in where we're having trouble meeting our critical needs. It can happen in any environment. So when I was teaching wilderness survival skills, people would often come to me and say, well, what about wilderness survival in an urban environment? And that was a really strange concept to me, because I was like, well, it's the same, if we're talking about shelter and water and hydrating yourself and all the things that we need as human beings, it doesn't change depending on what environment you're in. What really changes is the tools that we have available. So essentially our needs are the same no matter what environment we're in. And the really interesting thing that we don't generally really understand or acknowledge is that we already really know what our needs are. Every one of us is accomplishing our needs on a day-to-day basis, and we all have the ability to accomplish our general needs right now with the familiar tools and resources that we have available. What really changes in a survival situation is that we are faced with a situation where the usual tools and or things that we're used to using to accomplish those same needs are not available to us. And so we have to find alternate ways of doing those things. And so one person's survival situation might be another person's unexpected adventure. It really depends on our skills and abilities. You know, if somebody who's super capable and well prepared finds themselves lost in the woods, then they might just spend a night camping out in the woods. Another person who's ill-equipped and unprepared might potentially perish in that scenario. So we definitely want to take a good solid look at our own skills and abilities and our own scenario and situations to take a solid, I guess, assessment of what we need to do to prepare ourselves. And everybody's situation is going to be very individual. But what's important to remember is that there's no magic in this, that the problem remains the same, and every person is capable of accomplishing that problem with a little bit of critical thinking and ingenuity. We're really capable of solving these problems. So, you know, if we can do a really honest assessment of our vulnerabilities, you know, we can prepare for gaps in our knowledge and skills and abilities and resources potentially to take steps to improve potential situations that we might find ourselves in. So mentality is really, I say here, mentality is everything. I say almost everything because I kind of made a little joke about that, meaning that to me it's not it's not everything, but it's a good deal of it. And you know, one of our most critical strengths as human beings is our ability to think critically. And one of the challenges is that in a crisis, our brain really retreats into a very primal state where we're kind of in a fight or flight state, where we're acting on pure emotion like fear and not on logic. But really what we need is we need logic. We need that really clarity of thought and problem-solving brain in order to solve these complex problems that we're facing, in order to even understand what the problem really is that we're facing. So a calm mind is really, really critical to making good decisions and being able to solve your problem. So I know that, you know, I mean, people always say remain calm in a crisis, but the reality is that panic is a normal reaction to a critical crisis situation. And we shouldn't expect to not have that reaction. What we should expect is that we will have a panic reaction in a critical crisis that feels life-threatening to us. That way, if we expect it to happen, then we're not thrown off by it. We know that it's going to happen, and we are prepared for that to happen. What we need to do is we need to, once we feel that panic happening, we need to be able to acknowledge it and have a plan for how to calm ourselves down. You know, one strategy that I have is basically just to kind of sit down and calm down and evaluate the situation. A lot of times people will take steps too quickly to try and solve a problem prior to really evaluating the situation, and oftentimes those steps are in a direction that is counterproductive to solving the problem, and oftentimes makes the problem worse. A good example of that in the woods that I like to talk about is if you were 5 minutes ago on the trail and you knew where you were, and now you're lost, right? If you wander around for 2 hours just looking to find your way, now you're two hours and 5 minutes potentially away from the trail that you knew where you were. If you were to sit down and calm down and recognize that you were 5 minutes away from the trail, you could solve that problem and you could find your way back, right? So you're taking a small problem and you're turning it into a really big problem. And oftentimes when we have this emotional reaction to a crisis and we have an emotional response, we make things a lot worse than they already are, right? I have one of my mentors had a saying that I really liked, and he used to call it lose your mind and come to your senses. And one of my favorite ways to calm myself down in a crisis is to really activate my senses. And so activating my senses by essentially, we really cannot be in a high stress state and panicking and actually aware of all of our senses at the same time. So our sense of smell, our sense of feeling, our sense of hearing, all of these senses that we have. And so if you can just start trying to consciously activate your individual senses and then add them together, take some deep breaths, become aware of your breathing, close your eyes and get rid of your vision, and then push your hearing out and listen to the things that are around you. And then, you can open your eyes back up, feel what your skin is feeling, and just kind of really get in touch with your senses. That's a great way to quickly calm yourself down. And one of the interesting things that I've learned is that our brains don't really differentiate between a real physical crisis and an emotional crisis. And so when we face stress crisis in our everyday life, our brain can often take that as a life threat crisis. And so it could be, for example, you're stressed out at work, your boss needs to talk to you and you think you're going to get fired or something. That will be the same feeling that our brain has kind of a primitive place inside of it that deals with that kind of emotion. It feels like a life threat, right? It's obviously not a life threat, but it feels like that. And so if we learn to deal with those stress scenarios in our everyday life, and we learn coping mechanisms, then when we have a real life-threatening situation, we have coping mechanisms to understand how to calm ourselves down so we can make real decisions that will help us to not make decisions that lead to life-threatening injuries or death. So okay, so to me, survival theory is really simple. Now, survival in practice can be extremely complex, but survival theory is really simple, which is essentially understanding the problem that you have and identifying the problem and developing a solution. So it's very simple. If we can really, I'm a big fan of distilling things down into the simplest things, the simplest kind of nuggets we can. And to me, it's as simple as that. What is the problem? What is the priority of the problems we have, and how do we deal with them? And what is the potential solutions? And sometimes the definition of survival is that we don't have a solid, easy solution that we're familiar with. So we have to improvise solutions that we're not familiar with. If the heat's on and the water's working, and we can go turn on the heater because we're too cold, it's not a survival situation, right? When the heat's not working and the water's not working, and we have to, really deal with these things in a complex way, in ways that we're not used to dealing with them, that is when we have to really put those mental abilities to use, right? So this acronym I have created, well, I didn't create the acronym, but I've adjusted it for my purposes. It's an acronym that I learned when I was in the military, but I've changed some of it around a little bit because I didn't love what the other pieces that I made it more to my liking. But I really to me, it really helps us to understand the kind of key components that we would want to think about in a critical situation. And the first one, really important, sizing up the situation. Really taking an honest look at our situation and what is the crisis that we're facing. Sometimes when we take a look at the crisis, we'll understand, if we take an honest look at the crisis, that maybe the crisis isn't as bad as we think it is. Initially, we might have this reaction that we had this critical life threat crisis, and we realize once we take a deep look at it that really we're dealing possibly with an emotional crisis and maybe not a physical crisis. Maybe it feels really, really threatening, but maybe it's not. And we just want to take a really honest, objective look at the crisis. Or maybe we realize when we take a closer look at it that it's much worse than we possibly could have imagined at first glance. Either way, we really want to know all the variables that are involved and have a very clear picture of as big a clear picture as we possibly can to fully understand the crisis. And ideally, we fully understand the crisis before we take action, so we can take actions that are to address the most critical needs first, right? Using all your senses, once again, you can't really be panicking and using your senses at the same time. And another really important skill is to just be in the moment, right? So using your senses helps us to just be in the moment, dealing with that moment, and not really thinking about the past or pushing ourselves into the future and thinking about what the future might hold. This one's a little bit odd, I know, remembering your sense of humor. I'm a big fan of this. To me, there's a great book out there called Deep Survival by a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Gonzalez. Hope maybe they have it at the library. It really studies people, humans in really critical survival situations. It's full of great stories of humans that survived really incredible events, and some people, and stories of people that didn't survive really difficult survival scenarios. But it breaks down different people in different scenarios and who survived and who didn't, and what were the kind of common components between these different events. And the author really tries to get at what are some of the strategies that we might face in a survival scenario. One thing that he really identified in people that survived this just incredible events that we would assume that no human could possibly survive was that they were able to maintain a sense of humor even in really, really dark scenarios. And I have learned in my life that having a sense of humor, having the ability to laugh when things are really bad is a really important coping mechanism. And oftentimes it's that self-deprecating laughter. It's something that you did that was really dumb, that it just like, I can't believe I did that. And what I really feel is that the alternative to that is us feeling sorry for ourselves. And to me, feeling sorry for yourself is just the absolute worst thing that we can do. And I wish I had learned how to not feel sorry for myself. I have not done that yet, but I try to remind myself not to do that. You know, especially when I'm in really critical situations, right? And so to me, sense of humor is the anti-feeling sorry for yourself. It is the looking at life, you know, in a lightness about life, even when it's in dark situations and self-deprecating. So it's a skill that I've learned. I love it, and I try to practice it as much as I possibly can. So the crazier, more embarrassing thing that happens to me, if I can laugh at it, then all the better, right? So another one is verify your fears. So we should not be driven by fear, but fear is an important advisor to us. We really want to use fear as an advisor. We don't want to let fear be the captain of our ship. Fear is something to be noted, and sometimes it's irrational. And sometimes we need to ignore our fear and say, take an honest look at a fear that we have, like a fear, like we want to stand up in front of a bunch of people and give a speech, and we're terrified, like it feels like we're going to die, right? And we need to have some courage and just ignore that fear and say, hey, fear, this is an unfounded thing. I'm not going to die if I talk in front of these people. And we have to push it to the side. And other times fear is really critical, you know, to help us to stay out of danger. So I like this, verify your fears, you know, use fear as an advisor, a voice that helps you to stay on the right path. And one of the many voices in your head that you know, I sound like a little bit of a crazy person right now, but that's all right. One of the many advisors in your head, and fear should be one of them. Improvise, super, super important to improvise. Just, you know, it's not so important that we solve a problem in a particular way. It's just important that we understand the problem that we have, and I'm going to get into a bunch of different problems, and that we come up with a solution that works. So I could sit here all day and teach you solutions to problems that I know, but it's not important if you don't have the same materials or the same situation. And I know that in survival situations, we can often get into 1 million hypotheticals. What's available? What's this? What's that? What's really important is that we understand the root and the core problem. We understand the way that we can potentially solve that. How do things work, right? And we're able to improvise to create something that is a solution to that problem based on what we have available in that moment, right? Value living, something else that Lawrence Gonzalez in that Deep Survival book really harped on is that, sorry, my dog is barking. But something that he really harped on was everyone who survived these really intense scenarios had something that was they just could not give up. Something at home something inside of them, that whether it was a child, that they just couldn't leave. It doesn't matter what it is, just find something inside yourself that you just cannot let go of, and hold on to it. You absolutely have the ability to some degree will yourself to live or will yourself to die in critical scenarios. I truly believe that. And if you have something that you're holding on to, it's a really important element. Another one that really, really resonates with me is always work to improve your circumstances. So even in small ways, just continuously work to try your best to improve your circumstances, and also don't make things worse. So that's really important. A lot of times we think too quickly, or we do things, we act too quickly, and we turn a small problem into a much bigger problem because we act too quickly, and we make things worse. So we really want to evaluate and be cautious. And a lot of times when we're in a difficult stress situation, we're not really thinking that clearly. Maybe we haven't eaten as much as we normally do. We haven't drank as much as we normally do. We're tired. Our consciousness is we're not firing on all cylinders. We have to slow things down even more and really, really evaluate and think before we make decisions that potentially might get us hurt, or are really too risky, or just not worth, whatever we're trying to accomplish, right? Last one, live in the moment. Really just try and be in that moment right now. There is no sense in looking into the past in that moment when you're in a critical situation. Later, once you're through it, it's really important to do a bit of a dive back into that to figure out what happened and how you could have avoided that potentially. But when you're in the moment, no good will come from trying to think about, what if I had done this differently? What if I had done that differently? I wouldn't be in this situation right now. That's really just hindering you from moving forward. Doesn't matter how dumb a thing you did to get yourself into that situation, or if you ignore everything I say and there's another winter storm in 2 weeks and you're like, I should have done what Dave said, whatever, I just ignored him. It doesn't matter in that moment, because you're in the situation that you're in right now. You got to deal with that situation. Whatever happened in the past happened in the past. Once you're through the situation, you can reevaluate what you might want to do in the future. All right. All right, so it's vital that we learn to differentiate between, emotional and physical crisis. Our brains are not good at this. They're not good at differentiating between emotional and physical crisis. But we really need to do this, because when we're faced with a crisis, we just need to evaluate, is this an emotional crisis or a physical crisis? And what's really important is that oftentimes we have an emotional crisis. Remember, the I'm lost scenario, right? And I harp this back to things that we can all imagine. Like, a good example is that when we were kids, everyone was lost in the grocery store. That happened to every child. You're lost in the grocery store. That feels like a terrible thing, right? I'm lost. I'll never find my mom again. As a parent, as an adult, you're like, okay, you can't really get lost in the grocery store. There's plenty of adults. There's logical that's not a life or death scenario, but it feels like a life or death scenario, right? So we want to acknowledge that that's an emotional crisis. It's not a physical crisis. And an emotional crisis really requires an emotional response or an emotional intervention on our part. So if we're having an emotional crisis, if we're scared of something that is not an actual physical threat to us, we need to intervene with an emotional calming. If we're faced with a physical threat that is a physical threat to us, we don't want to take an emotional response to that physical threat, because an emotional response isn't going to help us at all. We need a physical response to that. What often happens is that someone is faced with an emotional crisis, right? I'm, lost the trail 2 minutes ago. That's an emotional crisis, because 2 minutes ago is not lost, okay? And they're going to take an emotional response to that physical crisis, or emotional crisis, or physical response, sorry, to that emotional crisis. And the physical response they're going to take is to wander around for 3 hours, right? Randomly looking for the trail, when really they need to stop and evaluate them and realize, okay, I was on the trail 2 minutes ago. I can logically calm myself down, and I can logically think through this and figure out how to find my way back to that trail and not create a real critical situation, life or death scenario. So a lot of times folks are getting themselves into there's an emotional crisis that leads to a physical crisis, which leads to death, right? So people don't understand that if they stop that, they're not in real danger. They think they're in danger emotionally, they put themselves in real danger, and they end up dying needlessly because they're not thinking clearly. So we want to calm ourselves down. We want to evaluate this scenario first and make sure that we're not making rash decisions, right? Okay, goods and services. Unfortunately, the way that our world works is that goods and services are really designed for essentially to accommodate the average. It maybe is slightly above average in certain scenarios, and that includes, the grocery store, and it includes all the goods at the different hardware stores, and even our services like police and fire and EMS. All these things, even our power grid, right? It's really designed for the average. So what we can expect from that is that anytime there's a increase in demand that is slightly above average or a little bit more than slightly above average, there's going to be shortages. Those shortages are going to cause panic. The panic is going to cause greater shortages, which is going to cause chaos. We need to be prepared for that to happen. We don't want to feed into that as best as we can, right? So we've seen this with gas. There's a hint of a gas shortage, right? Because people think there might be a gas shortage. Everybody goes to the gas station at the same time. Everybody tries to get gas. That causes a real gas shortage because the gas station is only set up for the average. The real gas shortage causes a crisis where people are panicked, and that causes we have an emotional crisis, right? Which led to a real physical crisis, right? So that's a bigger picture happening of that scenario that I was talking about. So what we want to do to prepare for this is we want to understand that we need to prepare prior to a crisis to have the things that we need. So we're not trying to go buy water the day that we hear that there could be a storm. We're not trying to go buy a water filter as soon as there's a boil water notice. That we're thinking through these crises in advance, so that we're not contributing to the crisis because we're buying in advance and we're preparing in advance, and we're not getting caught in the shortages, right? And then also we need to know that some of the services that we expect and count on cannot be counted on 100%. When there's a crisis, we can't necessarily count on an ambulance being able to get to our house, or a fire truck, or the police being able to be dispatched. If the police are expecting, if San Antonio PD is expecting, 150, I'm just throwing out a random number, 150 calls an hour, and they're policed and staffed for 150 911 calls an hour, and they get 4,000 911 calls in 1 hour. They just can't handle that kind of capacity, and no one is going to come. And so we need to be prepared for there to be scenarios where we have to be independent and self-reliant, and we won't necessarily have that. So it's a scary scenario, but we just need to understand that that's the reality of the world that we live in. I've created this little graphic for everyone to understand this. I call it the survival triangle, and it's really to understand our basic human needs and in what priority we should be addressing these needs in a crisis. So this is designed to be read from the top of the triangle in a clockwise manner, and it's really designed as a stop and fix method, or a stop and fix system. You should not be moving on through the system until you've stopped and fixed the thing that you're working on, or you've addressed and said, okay, that's fixed, right? So the first one is body temperature. Body temperature is the most critical human need besides being able to breathe and oxygen. It's something that we often overlook, and it's really important that we address it. Now, here in Texas, there are plenty of times a year where body temperature is just not an issue. You know, the weather is going to be nice. It's nice. We're not concerned about being too cold or generally too hot. And that's not really an issue. Now, if that's a scenario where body temperature is not an issue, we would just check in with it and say, is body temperature going to be an issue in the near future? If the answer is no, then we basically just check it off and we move on. We do want to look into the future. We don't want to just say, okay, it's 50 degrees right now, body temperature is not an issue. We want to look into the future and say, if you're going to have to spend the night, body temperature might not be an issue right now, but it's going to be 40 degrees colder tonight, and you have 3 hours until it gets dark. You do want to address your body temperature right now. Okay, so that's the most critical need, and you wouldn't move on to hydration generally unless until you've got a plan, a solid plan for dealing with your body temperature. And we'll talk more about body temperature strategies in a little bit. Next one is hydration. Essentially, just getting liquids into your body. Ideally, water is the best liquid we can be drinking, but the reality is that any liquid that that we can consume, that any liquid that we're used to consuming, is better than nothing. That includes milk, juice, soda. It might not be the most healthy thing, but it's definitely going to help hydrate you. Tea, even something like beer, not ideal, but you often hear that beer is dehydrating. Well, yeah, it's dehydrating compared to water, but it's not dehydrating compared to not drinking anything. Okay, so getting yourself liquids, ideally clear liquids, and having enough liquids is important. And here in Texas, it's really important that we're getting a lot of liquid, especially when it's hot. We really need to replenish our liquids when it's hot. If we're sweating, really, really critical. The human body, and I'm going to talk about this in a little while, the human body is really incredible at shedding heat, especially when we have good ventilation. But we're not so good at warming ourselves. We don't have a whole lot of hair on our body, but we're really good at shedding heat. But we do need lots of water in order to really effectively cool our bodies down. So hydration is really, really important, especially in the summer months, but something that we really want to think about. Luckily, it's a pretty easy problem to solve if we think about it in advance. And the next one is energy. So energy, just replenishing the calories that we are losing. And the harder we're working, and the harder our body is working, especially if it's really cold or we're in extreme conditions that we're not used to. If the power's out, our body's going to be working extra hard, burning a lot of calories. And if we think about our body like an engine, right, that's actually operating and keeping our body temperature up and operating with energy, we really need to think about the food that we're eating like physical fuel that is really necessary to keep our body operating. Now, you probably heard that a human body can go 30 days without food. That's absolutely true, but that's not really the whole picture. We do want to be replenishing our calories and planning for calorie replenishment so that we can really keep enough energy to keep our body warm and to keep active and to have enough energy to solve the problems that we're facing. And also mentally, it's really challenging to accomplish and tackle difficult situations if we're dealing with hunger problems and things like that. And in the United States, most of us are not used to dealing with food shortages. And so our bodies are not used to going without food. And so we have a lot of physical side effects because we're just not used to that. So we have, weakness and faintness, and we get really tired and lack of motivation and really bad headaches and things that in other countries where people are not eating as consistently, or families that might be super poor and don't have as much food, they probably don't experience those same side effects as people who never miss their mid-morning snack, right? So just expect that will happen if you don't, if you're not used to that. And the last one in the middle is just healthy body. And to me, all of these things come together to give us a healthy body. And our healthy body also is informing all these things as well, and it's all working together. So when you're planning for survival scenarios, you really want to check in with each of these individual things. And when you're planning for strategies and you're planning for buying things, you want to think about body temperature. How am I going to keep my body temperature healthy? And just kind of strategizing specifically about body temperature, and then strategizing specifically about hydration, and strategizing specifically about energy, and strategizing specifically about healthy body. And I found that when we can break it into these chunks, it's a lot easier to think about it than if we're trying to really think about it all at once, right? So to me, there's nothing more dangerous than a risk that we've either completely overlooked or that we or that we think we understand, but we've miscalculated. And so we really want to try and understand risk. And to me, the real root of a lot of this is to really do a deep evaluation, a real honest evaluation of our own skills and abilities and vulnerabilities, and what are the real risks, and how do we mitigate those risks. And luckily we can look into the past and we can see what potential pitfalls might befall us. Pretty much everything that has ever happened to human beings has happened. Probably nothing new is going to happen to us that's not happened to someone else. And so we can look to other stories of other people. We can see things that are happening in other cities. We can use those things to help to understand what things might possibly happen to us and how we might prepare for those things. Ultimately, though, it doesn't necessarily matter. We know what our needs are, right? Body temperature, hydration, energy. We know that that a crisis is really just a disruption in our normal ability or normal ways that we would deal with those things. And so we're just trying to maximize the options, the tools, and the resources and the skills and abilities that we have to solve those problems in the most amount of ways we possibly can. And then whatever scenario hits us, it doesn't really matter, because we're just able to be more fluid with the tools and abilities and techniques and knowledge that we have. Okay, so to me, there's this really interesting thing that happens, and I just started calling it the preparation prevention paradigm. And essentially, if we use a combination of like historical reference and I say imagination because to me, imagination plays a big role in my own preparation. I like to imagine and visualize myself in scenarios, and then as I'm visualizing myself in that scenario, I start to realize, I start to to see problems, and I try to strategize with how I would solve those problems. So, for example, I'll always harken back to this same thing, and I'm used to teaching wilderness skills. So if you wanted to go on a little hike in the woods in an unfamiliar area, you might imagine, what if you got lost, right? We're going to keep going back to this same one because it's a common thing that happens to people. And if you were to imagine, what it would feel like to get lost, you might then decide, I don't want to feel like that. I don't want to get lost. Therefore, I might look at a map in advance and kind of get ready for that. I might bring a few items along in case I do get a little bit turned around. I might bring a compass. I might learn how to use a compass so that I don't get lost. And so we're using our imagination, our visualization to prepare ourselves for a crisis. Now, if that crisis comes to be, we're prepared for the crisis, but in reality, what often happens is that the preparation for the crisis actually prevents the crisis, right? So remember that a crisis is something that we're struggling, right? We're struggling to survive. Remember that there was the scenario I said earlier where one person's kind of unexpected adventure in the woods might be another person's perilous, deadly night. The main difference is preparation, right? And knowledge. So if we're, two people could be in the same crisis, one could die, one could have a really cool story that they tell their friends. And preparation and ability and skill is really the difference. So, so there's this interesting paradigm again that visualization and imagination leads us to preparation, which most often leads us to prevention. Now, we can't prevent every crisis, right? But sometimes crises just happen to us. There's just nothing we could possibly do to prevent it, but hopefully it will be a lot worse than it would have been otherwise. And that's ideal. But a lot of times we just prevent crisis altogether. And that's really the goal, is we're preparing for crisis constantly, but in doing so, we're actually preventing the crisis from happening. I liken it back to, maybe I'm not real old yet. I'll be happy when I'm an old man and I can kind of say this from that perspective, but kind of the old school way of thinking of like living a really competent, boring life. I think the world today is really weird, and that everybody wants everything to be kind of real fantastic and like, I don't know, just off the wall. All these news stories about people doing really ridiculous, crazy things, and the crazier the thing, the more people are interested in it. I just liken it back to my grandfather. Wasn't ever getting lost. He was just going out and doing his thing and always coming back safely because he was well prepared and really capable. And maybe that didn't always make the best story because he wasn't getting lost and barely surviving by drinking the sweat from his socks. But ultimately, that's the kind of life that I'd like to lead, and that's the kind of life I'd like my students to lead, is an exciting yet uneventful life. We can have the exciting events that we want to have, and not the ones that we are unintentionally having. All right, so let's get into body temperature a little bit. So it's really important for us to talk about, and for me to help you to understand how heat is transferred. And so I really like to try to break these problems down to the point where you're understanding the core of the problem so that you can develop unique and improvise unique solutions to the problem. There are endless number of solutions to these problems, and potentially solutions that I would never think of, but that you might actually be able to create and think of. And that's one of the cool things about humans, is that we're able to really do this dynamic problem solving. And like MacGyver was the coolest example of this, someone who could just take this unique tools, and obviously that was just written as a Hollywood script, but this idea that you could take these unique tools and solve these complex problems, with just what you had available. And I love that idea. And so in order for that to work, I think we just need a really clear understanding of how things work. And so instead of teaching you a bunch of different shelter designs that you might make, I'd rather teach you about how this works, and so that you can then create something that works for you based on the materials that you have available to you. So first of all, how is heat transferred from our bodies? There's four main ways that heat is transferred from our body. And if I forgive you if you don't remember this from high school science class, because when I started teaching wilderness skills, I didn't remember this either. I probably didn't pay attention in this section, but it suddenly became interesting to me once I had some reason to pay attention to it. First one is conduction, and I can see that I have a typo in my outline here. Conduction. So that's direct contact. So that's two things touching each other. And the rule is basically that two things touching each other will ultimately eventually become the same temperature. Right? So if you're laying on a cold tile floor and your body is trying to warm that cold tile floor to the ambient temperature of your skin, and the cold tile floor is trying to warm your body or cool your body to its temperature, the one that has more mass will ultimately win. So you will never heat that tile floor to your body temperature. That body temperature will, or that tile floor will eventually cool you down to its temperature. And that's the reason, if you've ever gone camping and you didn't have a heating or a pad underneath your body, it feels like the earth is just sucking the life out of you, because the ground is just pulling all of your heat out of you. So radiation, that's the next one, and that's the process of heat just rising, right? So heat rises off of our body. Convection, that is air currents, taking the heat that is coming off of an object and transporting it away, taking it away. Evaporation, when water evaporates, there's a cooling effect that pulls heat away, right? And so in warm weather, and I like to talk about this really briefly, but like I talked about before, the human body is super capable of shedding heat. In fact, of all the mammals on the earth, there is no mammal on earth that is better at shedding heat than a human being. So we are so capable of shedding heat, and we are super efficient at getting rid of body heat. And so in most normal temperatures on earth, if a human being has a healthy body, plenty of water, good air circulation, and we can get out of the sun, so into the shade, and we can maybe fan ourselves, usually a healthy body can handle those temperatures. Now, some of the temperatures on Earth are changing in some spots, and that's becoming really difficult in some spots. But for the most part, the general rule is we're not super worried about heat if we can basically take it easy, we have plenty of water, and we can get out of the sun. Now, if you're working really hard and you're not drinking enough, you absolutely need to be worried about heat and heat exhaustion or heat stroke. But if you can drink plenty of water and you can kind of take it easy, you should be fine in about whatever temperature, heat temperature you would face in Texas. Now, because that's true, I'm going to focus more on cold weather. Now, the heat might not be comfortable, right? But I always like to separate out danger from discomfort. So a lot of times when we're dealing with, in fact, when we're dealing with survival scenarios, we're almost always uncomfortable, but discomfort is not the same as deadly, right? So we might be very uncomfortable, we might not sleep well, we might have a headache, we might really not feel well, but that doesn't mean we're necessarily going to die. So we might be really, really hot and uncomfortable and sweaty and chafed and things like that, but our body might still be functioning just fine. So I want to focus more on cold weather because that's something that our body is not very capable of, and human beings are not well adapted to cold weather. We really need a lot of tools in order to adapt to cold weather. So how do we, if we take all these 4 ways that we're talking about, heat is lost, we want to think about ways that we combat that in cold weather. So here's the solutions, essentially. The solution to conduction, if we talk about 2 objects touching each other, are conducting heat. The answer to conduction, to prevent conduction in cold weather, is essentially just separate those objects. So just do not touch things that are colder than you, okay? So or create some barrier between 2 things that are colder than one another, so that you're not right up against something that's a lot colder than your body. Radiation. Combating radiation is all about insulation, right? So insulation, we've all heard about insulation our whole lives. We need to use insulation to trap heat, to slow it down, essentially. So it's not rising up so fast. And now insulation isn't going to completely trap heat forever, but it's going to basically really slow it down so that we can keep an area warm for a longer period of time with less energy. Now, what's important to note is that we all have a perception of what insulation is, but we have this perception of like things that are insulators. But what's important for us to realize is that what we really want to know is what are the properties of an insulator, because there's a lot of things that can be that are good insulators that are not necessarily something that we would consider a good insulator. So if we think of things that are good insulators, they all have common properties, and then we want to find things that have those properties. So really good insulators, things like down or fluffy wool, or things like that, right? If you take the inside, like a mattress, right? All these things that are good insulators, a blanket, what they have in common is that they have a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? A lot of volume, okay, and not a lot of density. So I like to imagine that if we're filling a bucket, a 5-gallon bucket full of a material, how heavy would it be? And the lighter it would be, the better insulator that would be. So if we're filling a 5-gallon bucket full of down feathers, right, we fill it to the brim. We don't pack it down, we just fill it to the brim. It would weigh almost nothing. That would be an incredible insulator. If we fill a 5-gallon bucket full of dirt, how heavy would it be? Super heavy. That would be a really bad insulator. If we fill a 5-gallon bucket full of concrete, even heavier than dirt, it'd be an even worse insulator than dirt. If we fill it full of loose wool, super lightweight, great insulator. What if we fill it full of phone books, telephone books? Not a great insulator, right? We just stuff a bunch of phone books in there. But what if we took those phone books and we ripped the pages out and we crumpled them up and we put a bunch of crumpled paper in a 5-gallon bucket and we filled it up with crumpled paper? Like, now it's going to be super lightweight. Now we actually have a really good insulator, right? So we can sometimes take things that are not good insulators like paper and we can transform them and turn them into a good insulator. So anything that has a really high volume and low weight ratio can be used as an insulator. And anything in your house or anything that you find outside that has those properties can be used as a good insulator. So in the woods, one of the most common insulators that we use when we're building natural shelters is leaves. So just piles of leaves are actually really good insulators. And it's the same idea, right? If you fill a garbage bag full of dried leaves, it's really lightweight, and that's a great insulator. Now, if those leaves are wet, it's not as good an insulator as if they're dry. So because definitely it's more dense than if they're dry. So, you get the point here. So don't worry so much about the definition of insulator. Worry about the properties of insulation and think outside the box to find insulation that works well for you. Convection, essentially preventing air currents from taking away your heat. So in a house, luckily, our walls in our houses, as long as we have windows that close, will prevent convection. It will not provide insulation if we don't have a heat system, and it will not necessarily prevent conduction, because we might be touching things that are cold, but it will prevent convection. And evaporation is just all about staying dry. And so there's two main components to staying dry. There's staying dry externally from rain and snow and things like that. And then there's staying dry internally from not letting yourself sweat too much from activities so that you get wet from the inside out. And so on that note, I'm a big fan of layering my clothing a lot so that when I'm exercising, like I'm working, I'm shoveling snow, I'm working outside, I can shed layers and might even be down to a t-shirt if it's really cold outside. If I'm working hard and the second I stop working, I put my layers back on so that I'm not sweating and getting my clothing wet. Cotton clothing, really bad choice in wet and cold weather, because when cotton clothing gets wet, it sucks body heat away from us. And so it's a really bad material in cold weather. So choosing synthetic materials, wool or silk, much better options in cold weather, especially. And if you're going to wear cotton in cold weather, stay dry, okay? Stay dry. If cotton gets wet, either through sweat or rain or snow, it'll actually make you colder than if you didn't have it on at all. So if you get wet in cotton layers, better to actually strip those cotton layers off and and replace them with other layers, or even just take off cotton underlayers if you have other non-cotton underlayers, and get them dry. Hypothermia, super important to address. Obviously, I need to continue zipping through this. I get a little bit off on tangents, but some of the signs and symptoms of hypothermia, I just wanted to cover this really quick. Shivering, numbness of extremities, slurred speech or mumbling, clumsiness or lack of coordination, drowsiness or low energy, confusion, memory loss, or irrational actions. One common thing that people do when they're hypothermic is to remove their clothing. Even when it's really cold, you might see somebody who's removing their jacket, and everybody's really cold, but they're taking their clothes off. That's a really common thing. Irritability, potentially a weak pulse, and ultimately loss of consciousness. So one way to remember this is what we used to do in wilderness, talk about in wilderness medicine, was the umbles, which is mumbling, stumbling, fumbling, and grumbling. So people might, they're mumbling, they're having trouble, they're slurring their words, they're stumbling, they're losing their dexterity, they're fumbling with things, and they're grumbling, so they're a little bit irritable. A lot of times, unfortunately, when people get hypothermic, they get really irritable. We try to help them or we talk to them, they snap at us, and we want to retreat from them when really what they need is they need help from us. The real challenge with hypothermia is that once we cross the level of consciousness where we are starting to lose our consciousness and our ability to really think clearly, we're no longer capable of helping ourselves out of that situation. So if the person is starting to lose that rational thought because their brain is losing blood, because their body's pushing blood to their organs to try and preserve their life because they're getting too cold, they need somebody to intervene on their behalf. The real way to solve this is basically to get that person warmed back up. You don't necessarily need a heat source to warm the person back up. Their body is capable of doing it, but you just need to really get them in as many insulating layers as you can. In wilderness medicine, what we would do essentially is put the person inside 3 sleeping bags and then wrap that entire thing in a tarp with just their face exposed so they can breathe. So a sleeping bag inside of a sleeping bag inside of a sleeping bag with a person in the middle with a tarp wrapped up like a burrito, and we call this a hypo wrap. And that's how we would treat hypothermic people in the wilderness. And you can do the same thing with blankets and pillows and things in your house just to warm that person up. And let their body slowly return to temperature. And as soon as they start to slowly turn to temperature, they will start to come back to consciousness. Now, it's very important that if someone's hypothermic and they're unconscious, you need to handle them very, very carefully. Potentially, someone could even seem like they're dead. Their pulse can get so weak that it can be undetectable, but if they're jostled around, that can actually cause their heart to stop. So you want to be really, really careful with somebody who's severely hypothermic, and make sure you're just handling them with care. Don't drop them. Be really careful with them. Don't assume that they're dead. Sometimes the body can go into a hibernative state for a long period of time where the blood is pumping, but the heart is just barely beating, and we can't really detect it without a machine. And we don't want to assume that those people are dead. We want to get them medical care. We want to be very careful with them. So just a word of caution there. Want to quickly talk about home heating. I know that a lot of you all were shaken up by the power outage. Expect that your power could certainly go out, and we really want to anticipate that. So, there's a lot of possibilities for solving this problem. Ultimately, we want to be able to be prepared to survive without electricity, meaning that we might be very uncomfortable, but we have enough insulated material in our house to keep us alive without a heating system, enough blankets, enough clothing, that we can handle those temperatures. And like I said, it's very uncomfortable, but that is ultimately the best backup to your backup solution. But you want to understand how your home systems work. Is your home powered by electricity? Is your home heating system powered by natural gas or propane or wood? And is there do you have a backup to that system? So do you have a backup to your electric system? I am putting in currently a backup to my electric system in my house. I looked into, after the winter storm last year, I looked into whole house generators and found out that they're extremely expensive. It was going to be about $18,000 to put in a backup generator for my house, and I decided that wasn't an affordable option. So what I figured out is that I can put in a backup, essentially an outlet. I can get an electrician to install an outlet for a portable generator, which won't be capable of powering my entire house, but it'll be capable of powering some key appliances, and that will be much less expensive. So the generator itself will cost like $1,000 to $2,000, and maybe it'll cost about $1,000 or a little bit less to get the electrician to come and wire that so that I can operate my heat system and maybe a few lights and maybe a few key things in my house if I need to. So I've chosen to do that just as a backup system. If you have the money, that could be a great option. And if you don't have the money, obviously you need to figure out other options. But recommend that you try and figure out an alternative source of heat potentially to your main source. So if everything in your house is electric, maybe you try and figure out an alternative way to heat or alternative backup heaters that might operate off of something different. And even if, just to note, even if you have like a natural gas heating system, it still requires electricity and a small amount of electricity to operate, generally to operate those blowers on the heater and your thermostat and stuff. So often they won't really work if your power is completely out. So you need a slight small backup electricity to even operate those things. A word of caution. Remember, do not make things worse, okay? Carbon monoxide, super dangerous. We don't want to take something where we're like uncomfortable because we're a little bit too cold and we end up killing ourselves with carbon monoxide because we're uncomfortable, right? So we don't want to make things worse. Everybody should have smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors in your house. These things are not expensive. I think that oftentimes you can get them for free if you can't afford them. If you go to a fire station or something, a lot of times they'll give out free smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. You need to have these items in your home. They're life-saving, and there will be warnings on items that burn gas and that put off carbon monoxide. And you should not be operating those in areas that are not well ventilated.
Hey Dave, I have a question here in the chat.
I think you're on mute. Are you trying to?
It's me. Yes, I'm talking right now. Can you hear me?
Interject with a question.
Yes. What's an example of a backup?
I can't hear you. Oh, I've got you on mute. Okay, go ahead.
Got me on mute? Oh.
Oh yeah, I've got you. All right, okay, go ahead.
Okay. What's an example of a backup heater that uses alternate power sources?
So there are propane heaters that actually work that are designed for indoor spaces that you can purchase. You know, they are designed for propane. They have little, they use those small propane bottles that will work in indoor spaces. So that's one option of a potential portable heater system. I'm trying to think of what else you could do. I mean, small wood stoves could be an option that you might be able to, some of these might be longer term options to try and alter your plan overall. If you did buy a generator, but you didn't want to operate your whole house, you could have a generator that's operating with an extension cord that's operating electric heaters, right? So you've got a generator outside that's running some electric heaters inside your house, but it's not necessarily plugged into your home grid. And in that case, you can get away with sometimes you get away with a much smaller generator if you're not trying to operate, like an electric furnace, home furnace. You do want to be making sure that you're purchasing a generator that is capable of operating, that has enough watts to operate the heaters that you want to operate. A lot of times it's really shocking. Some of these really small heaters, they use a lot of watts and a lot of electricity, and especially heaters that have blowers on them, like a hairdryer uses a ton of electricity. And so you just want to be aware of that. And so sometimes some of my favorite electric heaters are more like the radiator heaters that you can buy that plug in, that have a thermostat on them, that don't have a fan component, but they just slowly heat up. They just sit on the floor and they just they're filled with oil and they just slowly heat.
Would that be I'm sorry, Dave. Would that be a better option for our patrons who live in apartment complexes and have a smaller area to heat?
Apartments, that's rough. I don't know what you do in an apartment. Honestly, I think those propane heaters that are indoor safe might be the best option. The only challenge is, you know, they use these small propane bottles, and I don't know how many hours you get out of those propane bottles. Honestly, I think ultimately the best option is to make sure that you have enough insulation to heat something, space with your body. So I'm going to talk about that next. But we have, our body is a heater, and we can heat a space with just our body, but we can't heat a big space with our body, you know. So there's not a lot of great options. Most of our systems are built on electricity. Apartments are much more complicated because you're just dependent on the system. You can't have a generator necessarily in your backyard or something like that. So that's a bit of a challenge for sure. But once again, just to harp on the CO2 thing, don't make your situation worse. It's not worth dying to be slightly more comfortable, right? You just want to make sure that you're really thinking through all the risk. And remember back to what I said, the biggest risks we can take are the risks that we don't fully understand, or that we think we've evaluated and we really haven't clearly evaluated, right? Right. All right. So internal home shelters. So this is a really cool thing that I think everybody should really understand. Understanding the concept of insulation. You know, I teach people how to build shelters in the woods using leaves and sticks and things like that, like all of our ancestors have done for hundreds of thousands of years. But we can actually do these things in our homes as well. And in fact, we teach a lot of kids programs that are Earth Native, and what I see in kids love building forts, right? And one of the cool things that I see is that I think that kids have this innate survival instinct, and that survival instinct is really a recreation of our instinctual patterns as humans. And to me, fort building is shelter building, right? This is something that our ancestors have done since the beginning of human experience, and kids are recreating that through play, right? So a lot of the things that kids are innately doing, catching things, you know, it's like that's foraging and learning how to hunt for your own food. And so it's not just rooted in play, it's actually an instinct. And so when you're faced with limited heat sources, or you have, you know, a limited heat source like a small heater that you can only heat a small space, right? You can't heat your whole house with this small heater, or you have no heater at all. We want to really minimize the space that we're trying to heat. And so creating a small shelter, we have, usually our homes are full of these insulating materials, things like couch cushions and mattresses and pillows and blankets. And we want to create basically a small internal shelter that's really well insulated, that we can get inside and just heat with our body. So imagine that your house inside is 28 degrees or 25 degrees, but you take every insulator you have, and you might mess your whole house up, meaning you pull your mattress off and you stack it against the wall, and you put your couch cushions on the floor, and you just create this fort, right? But you create this really small space that's really well insulated. You can get inside there and you can stay warm. Okay. Now it'll be a disaster to put back together at the end. Not super fun, but you'll create a nice cozy space for yourself, and you'll be able to stay warm. So ultimately, I know that we want to keep going back to these familiar things, and the familiar thing that we're used to is an external heat source to keep us warm. That's what we're used to. But really the problem that we're facing is that we need to keep our body warm. We have to think outside the box. We can't just think about the normal way that we solve that problem. We have to think about other ways, and we have to just really harp back to insulation. So an example of doing this is a thing that I call scarecrowing. So scarecrowing is something that I also teach in the woods, which works with natural insulators as well. And it's essentially if I have a couple of, or a single layer of clothing on, or a couple of layers of clothing that are not very warm, I can take insulated material and I can stuff my clothing and turn myself into like a scarecrow and really create a lot of insulation by putting those insulators into my clothes. So if I had socks, like long socks on, I could tuck my pants into my socks. I can stuff my pants full of fluffy insulated material. I can then tuck my shirt into my pants. I can stuff my shirt full of insulated material all the way through the back and the front. I can create this kind of real puffy, ness under my shirt, and I can really create an insulative layer. Now, it might mean that in my house, if I needed to, I might need to rip open one of my, or a few of my pillows in my house and take out that fluffy stuffing inside of there. And I know that there might be a resistance to doing something like that, like ripping open a pillow, like, like I don't want to mess up my pillow. I don't want to make a big mess. Like, these are things that we feel, but really it doesn't matter. Like, you can get a new pillow, you can clean that up. You got to focus on that crisis at hand. That's not important right now. None of those material things are really important in that moment. That pillow won't do you any good if you can't keep yourself warm. So scarecrowing is a super good tool. Like I said, even leaves outside, I teach this often. It works super well. If you have dry leaves and you stuff your clothes full of dry leaves when it's really cold outside, it is going to be uncomfortable. I know some of you are probably cringing about that. The biggest question I get is, what about bugs? Blah, 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 blah. It will save your life, Yeah, you might get a couple of bug bites. If it's that cold outside, there's probably no bugs anyway, because they're all hiding from the cold or they're dead. But it's really important. So would you rather have a couple of bug bites, or would you rather be dead of hypothermia? So just remembering that kind of stuff is really important. You can stuff your clothes with laundry, socks, underwear. Just put it in there. Stuff your clothes full. Make yourself a shelter. If you've got kids, make it into something fun. Try not to make it stressful. Build a family fort together. Get in there. Bring some cards. Play some games. They'll remember that forever. They'll have the funnest time ever. And you'll be safe, right? Okay, hydration, next one, super important. We take unlimited clean water in the United States for granted. We think we're going to turn the tap on and it's just always going to be there. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. We know that's not the case, and yet we still take it for granted, which is a really weird cycle. We all have experienced trying to turn on the tap and suddenly the water doesn't come on. We got to have backup water storage. We just have to. It's so cheap. We pay almost nothing for water. We all have it. We all can have access to containers to store it in advance. There's absolutely no reason for everybody here not to have backup water in case of an emergency. All right. I recommend storing at least 5 gallons of drinking water per person for emergency use. I recommend that you store that water inside your house. The last storm, I had a bunch of drinking water that I had stored outside, thinking I was really well prepared. It was about 50 gallons of drinking water. It was frozen solid. It was too much water in a big container. I couldn't carry it. I realized it was a major flaw in my plan, in that it was too much water in one big container and it was outside where it froze. So I'm recommending now that you keep water in no more than 5 gallon containers. Those are, you can pick those up potentially. 5 gallons is 40 pounds. If that's too heavy for you, then make it in smaller containers. Make it in 1 gallon containers, 8 pounds each. But make sure you can lift those containers, and I recommend that you store them indoors. They're less likely to freeze, at least during the winter months. If it's not during the winter months, you could probably store them outside in a garage or something like that. But if you pick a closet somewhere that's out of the way, and just keep that emergency water in there. Like I said, there's no reason not to do that. You don't need to go to the store and buy a ton of bottled water and stuff. I guess you could do that if you want to. It's still inexpensive, but you could just fill up containers and just keep those in your house. Purifying drinking water. Lots of different ways to purify your drinking water. One way is boiling. I'm not a big fan of it because it takes a lot of energy. Also, your water after you boil it is hot. You have to cool it off. I'm just not a big fan of boiling water for purification purposes. There's a lot better methods for that. Chlorine bleach. Be very careful to do this properly so you don't poison yourself, but you can use chlorine bleach to purify your water. Clorox.com has a recipe for how to do this. You can essentially put a small bit of chlorine. It's measured in like drops. Sorry, my dog sees somebody outside. It's measured in just a few drops. I believe it's something around 8 drops per gallon of water. And just look online and get the recipe, print it out, have it in advance, just put it in your laundry room or somewhere with the Clorox, and so that you have the recipe for how to do that. Really good tool. Most of us have Clorox around. That's and there's some nuances to it. The water needs to be pretty clear. It can't be real dirty water, but you know, it's a good method to know. Iodine or similar water purification tablets. You can get these at sporting goods stores. They're pretty easy. They're come in a small little bottle. Actually, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a picture of them. Not very expensive. Will purify quite a lot of water. It will leave a little bit of residual taste. Once again, slight discomfort, but not a major issue. Great thing to have around. No reason not to buy that in advance. Spend $10 or something and have that. SODIS is also a cool method for purifying water potentially. You can see I've got a picture of a water bottle here. There's a if you just type in SODIS, I tried to put a link in here, but I guess it didn't really work. SODIS, it's a solar water purification method that's developed for third world countries, where essentially you use the sunlight to purify your water. Essentially, if you put water in a smaller than 1 gallon container and you put it out in the sun for at least 6 hours on a full sun day, or basically a whole day of sunlight, or 2 days on a cloudy day, that will kill the bacteria in the water as long as the water is fairly clear. Make sure you look that up and understand the bit of nuances for that. And then one thing I didn't put on here, which I can't believe, oh no, this is purification. So this is purification. So this is killing the bacteria. What I'm talking about right now is killing the bacteria in the water, organic bacteria in the water. Another one is a SteriPen. You might have seen these before. It basically puts a UV light into the water. I'm not a big fan of these because they use batteries. I just don't love things that use batteries because in an emergency, if your batteries run out, you just can't count on it. And they're expensive. They're about $100. So to me, it's just not worth the money there for that. Electrolyte drink mixes are awesome to have around, especially if you're drinking water that potentially has a bit of a bad taste to it. That can help, and it can also help to kind of replenish your energy. So next way is water filtration. Much bigger fan of this overall. There's 2 types of water filters that you'll run into. One is like a straw or gravity-fed filter, and the other one is a pump water filter. My favorite is, and essentially the difference in water filtration and purification is purification is killing the things in the water. Filtration is actually removing it from the water. It's these little filter that's pulling the things out of the water, the organic contaminants that might hurt you, okay? So what we're talking about is if you needed to go down to the creek or the river near your house and gather water, you could run it through one of these filters and you can safely drink it, right? Or if there's a boil water notice and you've still got water, but you're supposed to boil it, you can run it through one of these filters instead and drink it instead of boiling it, okay? My favorite is a Sawyer Mini water filter. It's about, I think, $20 to $30. It comes with a little bag, and you can either put it in line with a tube with like a Camelback type system and let it gravity feed, or you can suck through it like a straw, or you can attach it to the bag or a water bottle, like a Coke bottle or something, and squeeze it out through there. Really pretty inexpensive. And very versatile system. A pump water filter will filter a lot more water, and you can use it for the whole family. It'll filter potentially thousands of gallons of water for you. They do require a little bit of maintenance, so you want to make sure that you're reading the manual and that you're taking care of that. This is a critical item that if you can't afford to buy much to prepare for a crisis, this is something that I really recommend that everyone buy. It's also something that is not readily, it's readily available right now. You could probably have it on Amazon tomorrow. You could go to the sporting goods store right now and buy it. But if there was a widespread crisis, you're not going to find these available and you're not going to be able to get them. So it's something that you'd want to buy in advance and have available, not very expensive, especially if you're buying something like the S.U.R.V.I.V.A.L Mini. If you're investing in a pump water filter, it probably lasts you for a really long time, but you're talking more of an investment about $80. But it could potentially just solve a lot of your water concerns, right? Also, water transport containers are really critical. So even if you don't necessarily have all your containers filled up with water, you want to have the ability to transport containers in case you need to go somewhere and pick up water and bring it back. So making sure you have containers that you can use to transport water is really, really important. Know where your closest natural water sources are. Ideally, spring-fed water sources are the best, stagnant water is not ideal. A stagnant pond or something like that still can be rendered drinkable if you use a water filtration system. But generally, the more stagnant water is, the higher the contaminants. Also, the higher the organic contaminants, but those filters can filter out organic contaminants. All the purification systems all the purification methods can kill those organic contaminants if you do it correctly. The one concern that I have in urban environments is potential chemical contaminants. So one thing we want to look out for if there's a widespread disaster, sometimes we'll have chemical contaminants, things like gasoline or oil, or other chemicals in the water sources. You want to look out for dead vegetation or a really bad smell of the water, something like that, to try and make sure that you're not drinking water that is chemically contaminated. That being said, you want to, if you have, my rule basically is that if you're dehydrated and you need water to survive, you want to drink the safest water that you can you want to drink the safest water that you can get. You don't want to die of dehydration being scared to drink water that you're worried about, right? It's better to take a little bit of risk, in my opinion, if there's no other option, but you don't want to be put in that position. So you want to have the right kind of equipment, the right kind of filters and things like that to make sure you're not in that position. But be familiar with the water sources, especially the ones that you could walk to from your house. Don't be scared to drink water out of a creek. As long as you're filtering it or purifying it, it's going to be okay. In the woods, I've drank plenty of wild water out there, filtered through a filter. Sometimes it tastes a little bit off. We're used to, the chlorine taste or the taste of the water from our tap. But those systems do work, those methods do work, and you should be fine as long as you're following the instructions properly. Emergency food, maintaining calories is really important. Having backup food supplies is really, really great. I recommend that you plan for, I recommend everybody have 2 weeks supply of food. I think we often have a lot more food than we think we have. We have the random stuff that we are kind of avoiding eating, random weird pasta or whatever that's sitting in the back of the pantry that we always kind of skip past or whatever we got. There's a lot of random stuff that we often have lying around that we would eat if we had to, but we might not choose it, for dinner on a random night. But I recommend that we kind of evaluate that and we have at least 2 weeks of food available. There are options. One option is to just build up a surplus of shelf-stable food that you normally eat, and then just kind of making sure you have extra. And then the other option is to actually buy emergency food that you're not planning on really eating unless there's an emergency. And the options there are like freeze-dried emergency food. They have options at Costco, or you can order it online. The downside is that you probably won't eat that freeze-dried food if there's not an emergency. And so you have to be willing to kind of gamble on that money and pay whatever you're going to pay for that food, recognizing that it might last 10 years. And in 10 years, if you don't use it, you're just kind of out that money. But you get the peace of mind of having that food wherever you've got it stored and you don't have to worry about it. And then MRE rations or something like that, pretty expensive, last a little bit more, like maybe 5 years. You know, if you have the money, it can be a fine option. Also, again, it's not something that I'm necessarily going to eat if I'm not going to use it for an emergency. So really something that you'd only want to do if you had some kind of a bunch of disposable income. And then there's also like emergency ration bars, which are designed for like life rafts and things like that. They're really designed with like all of the nutrients that you would need. They taste often kind of like a sugar cookie. Sure, you can buy those. I wouldn't say they're super expensive. They're really, really calorie dense. You can see a picture of that in the bottom left-hand corner, but you're not going to be happy eating that for a couple of weeks for sure, but it'll keep you alive. Another tip is just maybe keep some multivitamins around. If you're eating not a diet, you know, maybe you're not eating, you know, fresh foods like vegetables and fruits and things like that because you're eating a lot of freeze-dried things or a lot of things like pasta and stuff, you might have some vitamin deficiencies that might kind of mess with your energy levels and things like that. So having some multivitamins that you can take to kind of supplement yourself is a nice tip to have. Energy or food consumption strategies. So you do want to have a strategy for how to consume your food if your power goes out. First thing you want to be eating is those things that are going to really go bad really fast. You want to be milk, meat, salad greens, things like that, that you just want to consume those first and fast. You know, you might not even want to add other ingredients to make a meal. You might just have to kind of put things together that seem really weird together because that's what is about to go bad. Then you want to shift to your more stable but fresh foods like certain fruits and vegetables, eggs, things that might keep for a few days, but then are going to go bad. Freezer, you know, obviously it would be next. Things in the freezer will often stay good for many days after the power goes out. Depending on how full the freezer is, how dense those foods are, you kind of want to keep checking on them. And then the pantry, obviously last, those shelf-stable foods. We want to avoid eating those until the last because they will last, obviously. A cool tip is to fill your empty freezer space with water containers. Those water containers will freeze solid. That will be huge, big chunks of ice in your freezer, which when your power goes out, that will really extend the life of the food in your freezer, essentially turning your freezer into like an ice box. And many, many days, it will extend the life. And also it will save you on your power bill because your freezer will be more efficient. And that will be a backup emergency water once that defrosts. You'll be able to potentially drink that water. Now, if it's below freezing in your house, then that will never thaw out and you'll just have your freezer working forever. But that's a really cool thing to do is to keep any free space in your freezer. I like to use smaller bottles in my freezer. And what I basically do is as I fill my freezer up with food, I'll pull those bottles out and kind of put them in the pantry or wherever, and I'll just let them defrost. And then when the freezer starts to get emptied a little bit, I pull those bottles back and I stick them back in the freezer and fill that empty space, let them freeze again. And I just kind of cycle them in and out. And so that, yeah, if the power goes out, I've got a lot of ice in my freezer and then they don't leak everywhere like ice would in your freezer because they're in containers. So that's a really tip that I really like. Also, mental energy matters, really matters. I've been teaching students wilderness skills for 15 years. There's a huge difference between different students. Some eating the same amount of food for 5 days in a survival, a contrived survival scenario. Some of them maintain a real positive mental attitude and also maintain a lot of positive, with that positive mental attitude often comes a lot of energy to try and improve their situation and continually work and things like that. And other people kind of start to feel sorry for themselves and curl up into a ball and just kind of like try and wait it out and just do nothing and kind of go into a hibernation mode. So I've come to understand that there's like the physical energy that we're getting from calories, and there's really this mental energy that we can through toughness and just sheer grit, we can just pull out of ourselves. And so I like to try and use that as an inspirational point to help people understand that you can do it, pull yourself up, try and take any step you can to improve your situation. If you're recognizing that pattern of feeling sorry for yourself, which is a normal thing that we all do, just try and find something that you can do to get up and improve your situation and take steps to make things better. Healthy body. I'm running low on time here, but I'm pretty close to the end. Good first aid skills. I cannot speak more highly about how important this is. I am a former wilderness EMT. Of all the skills that I've learned in the last 20 years, wilderness skills, my wilderness EMT skills have been by far the most useful. I use them all the time to help myself and my family. I highly recommend that everybody take a good backcountry first aid class. I recommend backcountry first aid because what it's really designed for is it's first aid in environments where medical care is not readily available. So yes, it's designed for being out in the middle of nowhere, hiking in the mountains, but that's the same scenario. Medical care is not readily available as a major storm where fire and police and EMS cannot get to your house, right? Both scenarios, medical care is not readily available. In both scenarios, you are trained with backcountry first aid to deal with extended scenarios where EMS or hospitals or doctors are not there to help you for an extended period of time, potentially days and days and days. So there's a wilderness first aid course. That's about a 2-day class, really good introductory thing to take. And then if you're really interested in this, you want to really get into it, there's a class called Wilderness First Responder. And that essentially will really teach you pretty much everything you need to know. It's a 9-day class, but a really significant investment in learning first aid. And it's a full 9 days, really long days, but really, really, really valuable, and highly recommend that to everybody. So some supplies to have on hand, a really good first aid kit. I recommend Adventure Medical makes a really great backcountry first aid kit that's designed for having limited medical care available. And then some other things that are really important. Remember that you need to have an extra supply of critical prescription medications. If you have medications that you're taking that are really critical, you need to make sure you have enough backup supply of those medications in case the Postal Service can't get to you. The supply chain is cut down for a temporary period of time. If you wear contact lenses, one thing that I really noticed is that a lot of people who wear contact lenses do not have a backup pair of glasses. That's a critical mistake. You should have a backup pair of glasses. If you wear contact lenses, if you wear glasses, you should have a backup pair of glasses. Sometimes I'll often recommend when you get a new pair of glasses and you slightly update your prescription, or you have a pair that's slightly scratched or something, you put those to the side as your backup pair. They're not your favorite. Maybe they don't let you see the most clear, but they'll work if you needed them in a crisis as a backup. Also, as we know, a supply of N95 masks. I used to talk about pandemics back like 5 years ago, and I think people kind of groan at me like, oh, that's such a weird thing to talk about. I personally have purchased N95 masks for my family in case there was a pandemic prior to COVID, and had to kind of find them in my garage when it happened. But what I've noticed is that people were so quick to move on when we had this like slump in COVID and we all thought it was going away. A lot of people were just like getting rid of everything, not prepared again, even when we had supplies of N95 masks back in stock. So once again, now there's a shortage of N95 masks. You cannot get them, but 2 weeks ago you could get them. So there's really no reason that we should go through these cycles where we're caught off guard. We should be prepared with things, looking into the past and looking into the future and kind of prepared for what might come. We honestly have no idea what could possibly happen, how this thing will evolve. We just want to be fully prepared. Planning and communication. I've only got a couple of slides left. Make sure you have a plan with your family members. One thing that people do that's really not great is to anticipate that they can count on technology. Technology will fail in a widespread crisis. We can almost guarantee that it will fail us. The problem is that, you know, this isn't 1985 anymore, where we had a plan. Hey, let's meet up at 2 o'clock at the mall in front of JCPenney. We don't do that anymore. We just assume that we can get a hold of anybody at any time by all these means, phones, text, whatever. And as soon as technology fails, we are completely blind. We don't know where people are. We don't know how to reach them. We don't know how to connect with them. We have to go back to old school methods of having a physical plan in place for when technology fails us, and just having a really simple discussion with your family can really go far to just say, if something happens and we cannot communicate, this is where we're going to meet. And this is not just for a crisis, but anytime you go to a major event where there are a lot of people, where there's an opportunity to get separated, it's worth just having a quick conversation in advance. If something happens, we will meet up here. If we cannot find each other at this time, somebody could lose their cell phone. Who knows what could happen? But just having that really quick multi-sentence conversation can really set the difference between a crisis and just a quick communication that you find your way. So just really quickly talk through these scenarios with your family, and then keep some basic emergency supplies in your vehicle as well. One thing that I really like is a jumper pack. So there's some new technology in the last decade that's come out, which is incredible, which is the ability to jump your own car battery with a small jumper pack battery. It's like a lithium ion battery that you can charge up. It will last a year, and you can jump your own car battery with it. You don't need to rely on somebody else to jump your battery. Super, super useful item to have in your car. Plus a 12-volt tire air pump in your car is also really nice. And I just like to keep a small emergency kit in my car as well. In the winter, having extra warm clothes or something if you were to get stranded in your vehicle, and extra water. So thinking of your vehicle as almost like a mini survival kit as well. And then some strategies for preparing for a disaster on a budget. I know this seems overwhelming. A lot of times people will come to me and they're like, well, I don't have many thousands of dollars to spend on items. I don't think that you need to necessarily do that. I think you want to break down each of these categories: body temperature, hydration, energy, and healthy body. You want to determine what things you already have. There might be the really cool things that you wish you had the money to buy, but you can get by with something that you already have. Okay, so what are the things you already have, like blankets and insulators, and then determine what things you have, and what things can be improvised, right, or cannot be improvised, right? What are the things that you cannot improvise? A water filter. That's not something that you're going to make. It's a small expense. It's something that you'd really want to identify as a purchase item. First aid supplies, something that you'd want to identify as a purchase item. Plastic sheeting, something that you might want to purchase that's really useful for maybe potentially shelters or something. Like I didn't talk about this earlier, but you could section off little areas of your house. If you have a small heater, you can tape up plastic and section off a small space in your house to warm it up, instead of trying to heat an entire big room with a small heater. Also, if you don't have a lot of money, maybe try and stock up on shelf-stable food really slowly when you go to the store. Maybe you buy a couple of items each time you buy a bag of beans, or you buy an extra box of pasta, and you just try and slowly stock up on food items little by little as you take trips to the grocery store. Try not to fall prey to marketing schemes. There's a lot of companies out there that recognize that they can tap into that emotional feeling that you have of vulnerability and crisis, and they can get you to buy their product because they can get you to feel like if you don't buy this product, you're going to die, right? You have to buy this product. And so that's really powerful. You go, what, like, I know we can't afford this, but we don't want to die. What good is this money if we're going to die, right? And so you get trapped in this emotional feeling of you have to purchase this product. I'm not saying that there aren't good products out there that you might not want to buy, that might not be worth it. But anytime you're feeling that feeling, you want to be really skeptical of that. And it's a lot of time it's a marketing gimmick. It's not something that you necessarily need to buy. And you just want to be skeptical. You want to do the thing that we do in a crisis, right? We want to treat that like a crisis. We want to sit down, calm down, evaluate the situation, determine whether we're making the right decision or not. Remember that humans survive best in community, and help your neighbors, okay? We have to come together in crisis. It breaks my heart what's happening in the United States right now, where everybody's fractured. We have to learn to come together and help each other. A lot of times, crisis actually brings out the physical crisis, not political crisis, but physical crisis actually often brings out the best in us. And we have to ask our neighbors for help, and we have to reach out to our neighbors to help them. And we'll get through everything together. I'll leave this up. This is just some items that I recommend for you guys while I'm answering questions. This is my last slide. I'm a little bit over time, but I'll stay on a little bit if we have some questions.
Oh, that was a lot of information, Dave. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in chat and we can go through them, or you can take a screenshot of this that's on the screen right now, Dave's information. I like that idea. Take a picture of this with your cell so you have it for later.
Yeah, and these are just items that I'm recommending. Honestly, it's, once again, everybody's situation is personal. I think it's just a nice place to start. Don't feel like you have to be pressured to go out and buy a bunch of stuff. You just want to start with an evaluation of what are your needs, right? Start with that survival triangle. How are you going to accomplish those things without the normal methods that you're used to, without your thermostat, without your heater, without your spigot? And then figure out the tools you have available and just start to think through these things. Use that visualization technique to try and work through this in advance, and then determine what you might want to purchase that might be helpful to you.
I saw a lot of hacks during after the first storm that we had last year. A lot of hacks on the internet on how to heat your house. So I think preparedness is definitely the way to go. I'm not seeing any questions in chat. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Dave. Thank you so much. A recording of this will be on YouTube later as soon as we get it uploaded and processed and all of that. Everybody have a nice day and stay safe.
Thank you all so much.